Bullies ripped the new girl's skirt. Big mistake. Senna Ashford had learned to make herself invisible long before she walked through the double doors of Lincoln High School on that humid Monday morning in late August. The art of disappearing in plain sight had become second nature during the 3 years she'd spent training at her uncle's gym in Phoenix, learning to channel rage and grief into precise, devastating combinations that landed on heavy bags instead of human faces. Her mother's final words echoed through her memory every time her fists instinctively curled at her sides. "Promise me you'll leave the fighting behind. Promise me you'll find another way. Violence only breeds more violence, baby girl. Break the cycle," Senna had promised, her hand gripping her mother's as the monitors beeped slower and slower, and she'd meant it with every fiber of her being. That promise was the only thing keeping her knuckles from splitting open on someone's jaw during those first terrible weeks at Lincoln. The school itself sprawled across 6 acres in the heart of Sacramento, a massive 3-story brick building that housed over 2,000 students, whose voices created a constant roar in the hallways between classes. The main entrance opened into a cavernous lobby with scuffed linoleum floors that squeaked under sneakers, walls lined with trophy cases displaying decades of championship victories in football, basketball, and wrestling. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, slightly greenish glow that made everyone look slightly ill. The smell hit her first. A combination of industrial cleaner, cafeteria food, teenage sweat, and something indefinable that seemed to permeate every high school in America. Senna adjusted the straps of her backpack, kept her eyes down, and navigated toward the administrative office to collect her schedule. She'd chosen her wardrobe carefully that first day. Dark jeans that allowed freedom of movement, a plain grey hoodie that hid her frame, sneakers with good traction. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup, nothing that would draw attention. At 5'6" and naturally slender, she didn't have the kind of build that screamed athlete, unless you knew what to look for. The definition in her shoulders, the way she moved with her weight distributed perfectly, the unconscious vigilance in how she scanned every room she entered. These were tells that most people wouldn't recognize, but to anyone who knew martial arts, they were as obvious as a neon sign. Senna kept her distance from everyone, spoke only when spoken to, and tried desperately to fade into the background. The first 2 weeks passed in a blur of getting lost between classes, eating lunch alone in the corner of the massive cafeteria with her earbuds in, and avoiding eye contact in the crowded hallways. Lincoln High had its established social hierarchy like any school, and Senna had no interest in finding her place in it. She just wanted to get through each day, get home to the small apartment she shared with her aunt, and try not to think about Phoenix, about the gym, about the way her hands still ached to wrap themselves in tape and leather. She'd sold her gloves before leaving Arizona, a symbolic gesture that had felt like ripping out part of her soul, but she'd done it anyway. Her Aunt Rosa didn't know about the training, didn't know that Senna had spent 3 years becoming someone who could drop a grown man with a properly executed liver kick or sweep someone's legs so fast they wouldn't know they were falling until they hit the mat. But invisibility, Senna quickly learned, was not the same thing as immunity. Bryce Callahan noticed her on the 3rd day, and that was when everything started to unravel. He was impossible to miss. 6'2", broad-shouldered from 4 years of varsity football, with the kind of easy confidence that came from being told you were special since you could throw a spiral at age 7. His father was Councilman Callahan, his mother sat on the school board, and his older brother had gotten a full ride to USC on a football scholarship. Bryce wore his entitlement like cologne, something that announced his presence before he even entered a room. He had 3 loyal followers who trailed him like remoras following a shark. Connor, who was tall and rangy with a cruel sense of humor. Marcus, who was built like a tank and served as the muscle when intimidation was needed, and Tyler, who was smart enough to be Bryce's strategist, but insecure enough to need the borrowed power that came from being part of the inner circle. Senna had been walking to her fourth period English class when Bryce first spoke to her, or rather at her. "Hey, new girl, lost?" His tone was condescending, not concerned, and his friends laughed like he'd said something brilliant. Senna had kept walking, keeping her expression neutral, but she'd felt his eyes tracking her movement down the hallway. That was the first mistake, not acknowledging him, not playing the game, not showing the appropriate deference to someone who sat at the top of Lincoln High's food chain. The next day, Connor bumped into her hard enough to send her books scattering across the floor near the lockers. "Oops, sorry." The word dripped with insincerity. Other students flowed around her like water around a stone. Nobody stopping, nobody helping, everyone's eyes sliding away with the practiced indifference of people who'd learned not to get involved. Senna gathered her textbooks in silence, her jaw tight, counting her breaths the way Uncle Marcus had taught her. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Control the breath, control the body, control the response. By the end of week 2, the pattern had established itself with the inevitability of water finding its level. Bryce and his crew had decided Senna was their new project, the perfect target. Quiet, new, with no friends to back her up and apparently too scared or stupid to fight back. The incidents escalated gradually, each one testing the boundaries of what they could get away with. A shoulder check that slammed her into the lockers hard enough to leave a bruise on her ribs. Her backpack accidentally kicked down the hallway, contents spilling everywhere. Whispered comments when she walked past. "Freak, loser, bet she doesn't even speak English." Ethnic slurs that made her blood boil because they couldn't even get their racism right. Her mother had been Italian and Irish, her father Mexican, but to idiots like Bryce, anyone with dark hair and tanned skin was apparently the same thing. Senna absorbed it all in silence, her face a mask, her fists clenched inside her hoodie pocket where nobody could see. She'd catch herself in the bathroom mirror sometimes, surprised by her own reflection. The girl staring back at her looked defeated, shoulders hunched, eyes down. This was what her mother had wanted, right? Walk away. Don't engage. Violence solves nothing. But her mother had never had to walk through hallways where people treated you like you were less than human, had never felt the particular burning humiliation of being shoved against a wall while 30 people pretended not to notice. The cafeteria became the primary theater for her daily humiliation. Lincoln's cafeteria was an enormous space that could seat 500 students at rows of long tables, with the food service area along one wall and floor-to-ceiling windows along another that looked out onto the athletic fields. The noise during lunch period was deafening, hundreds of conversations happening simultaneously, trays clattering, chairs scraping, the occasional shout or burst of laughter. Senna had claimed a small table in the far corner, near the emergency exit, where she could sit with her back to the wall and see most of the room. It was a tactical choice she'd made without thinking, the kind of awareness that came from months of sparring where knowing your surroundings could mean the difference between landing a combination and eating a counterpunch. On Wednesday of week 3, Bryce and his crew made their move during lunch. Senna was halfway through a turkey sandwich, earbuds in, trying to focus on the history homework spread out in front of her when she felt someone standing behind her. The back of her neck prickled with awareness, that ancient prey animal instinct that something predatory was near. She pulled out one earbud and turned to find all 4 of them standing there, Bryce in the lead with a carton of chocolate milk in his hand and that same smug expression he always wore. "You sitting by yourself again, new girl. That's sad." His voice was loud enough to carry to nearby tables, drawing attention, which was exactly what he wanted. "We should help you out. Give you something to remember us by." Senna's muscles tensed, ready to move, but she forced herself to remain still. "I'm fine, thanks." Her voice came out steady, which was a victory in itself. "I don't think you are fine." Bryce's smile widened, and before she could react, he tipped the entire carton of chocolate milk over her head. The cold liquid splashed across her hair, face, and shoulders, soaking into her hoodie, dripping down onto her homework and textbooks. The table erupted in laughter, not just Bryce's crew, but nearby students who'd turned to watch the show. Someone was filming on their phone. She could see the glow of the camera in her peripheral vision. Senna sat frozen for 3 heartbeats, chocolate milk dripping from her hair, running down her face. The humiliation so complete and total that she couldn't breathe. Her hands were shaking under the table, not from fear, but from the effort it took not to explode into action, not to pivot in her seat and drive her elbow into Bryce's solar plexus, not to sweep his legs and put him face down on the cafeteria floor before he knew what hit him. She could see the entire sequence in her mind with perfect clarity. 5 moves, maybe 6 seconds, and he'd be gasping for air while she stood over him. Instead, she grabbed her ruined books, stood up slowly, and walked toward the bathroom with as much dignity as she could muster, while covered in chocolate milk and followed by the sound of laughter. In the girls' bathroom, she locked herself in a stall and finally allowed herself to cry, hot, angry tears that she wiped away viciously with toilet paper that scratched her face. This was exactly what her mother had been afraid of, that Senna would turn into her father, who'd solved every problem with his fists until violence was all he knew. The old man had died in a bar fight when Senna was 12, stabbed over a poker game, and her mother had looked at 13-year-old Senna and said, "You're not going to end up like him." I won't allow it. But sending her to Uncle Marcus's gym had been supposed to be therapeutic, a way to process grief and rage in a controlled environment. Nobody had expected Senna to be a natural, to take to kickboxing like she'd been born for it, to develop the kind of speed and power that had her sparring with adults by 15. The promise she'd made on her mother's deathbed was the only thing standing between who she was and who she could become. The pattern continued through weeks 3 and 4 with relentless consistency. Bryce had found his entertainment, and he wasn't done yet. Her locker was vandalized, the word TRASH spray-painted across the front in black letters. Senna had to use a different locker, tucked away in a less convenient part of the building, and nobody seemed to care that hers had been destroyed. She'd reported it to the main office, speaking with a tired-looking administrator who'd taken her name and assured her they'd look into it. But nothing ever came of it. The camera in that hallway had conveniently been broken for weeks, she was told, and there were no witnesses willing to come forward. Her phone started receiving anonymous text messages, insults, threats, photoshopped images of her face on humiliating pictures. She blocked the numbers, but new ones kept appearing. Social media accounts that she didn't even have started appearing with her name, posting embarrassing content, fake confessions, crude sexual come-ons. Senna didn't have Instagram or Snapchat, had deliberately stayed off social media to avoid exactly this kind of situation. But that didn't matter. Someone had created entire fake profiles dedicated to humiliating her, and they were sharing them with half the school. By the end of week 4, Senna was eating lunch in her car, a beat-up Honda Civic that Aunt Rosa had helped her buy, parked in the far corner of the student parking lot. She'd arrive early, stay late, and time her movements between classes to avoid the main hallways when they were most crowded. Former acquaintances, she couldn't call them friends, since she'd never really made any, stopped making eye contact. Teachers who'd seemed friendly during the first week now looked through her like she was invisible. Nobody wanted to associate with the target, to risk becoming collateral damage in Bryce's campaign of systematic harassment. The worst part was watching other students experience what she was going through and being unable to help. There was a freshman who Bryce's crew would trip in the hallway, sending him sprawling, books flying. There was a girl in Senna's chemistry class who Connor made crying at least once a week with vicious comments about her weight. There was a kid who dressed goth who Tyler loved to torment, calling him homophobic slurs that made Senna's stomach turn. She'd wanted to intervene, to step in, to use her physical presence to create space for these victims to breathe. But she couldn't. Getting involved meant revealing herself, and revealing herself meant breaking her promise. And breaking her promise meant becoming exactly what her mother had died trying to prevent. Week 5 brought an unexpected complication in the form of Julian Torres. Senna first noticed him in her English class, where he sat 2 rows over and 3 seats back, close enough that she'd catch him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell into his eyes, and the kind of face that was more interesting than classically handsome. Sharp cheekbones, a nose that looked like it had been broken at least once, eyes that seemed to see more than most people's. He played guitar in a local band she'd learned from overhearing conversations, and he had the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to prove itself. Their first real interaction happened on a Friday afternoon in the library. Lincoln's library was Senna's refuge, a vast space with high ceilings and rows of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that created little isolated alcoves where you could disappear for hours. The light was different here, softer, filtering through windows that overlooked the courtyard. The smell of old books and new carpet created an oddly comforting combination, and the strict no-talking policy meant it was one of the few places in the school where Senna could breathe. She'd been researching for a paper on the Harlem Renaissance, buried in a biography of Langston Hughes, when someone dropped into the chair across from her. "You're in my English class." Julian's voice was low enough not to disturb anyone, but it startled her anyway. Senna looked up, defensive walls immediately slamming into place. "Yeah." She kept her tone neutral, not encouraging but not outright hostile. "Mrs. Patterson asked me to give you the assignment from yesterday, said you left early." He slid a paper across the table, handwritten notes about the essay they'd been assigned on Gatsby symbolism. Senna blinked, surprised. She'd had to leave after Bryce had knocked her water bottle across her desk, soaking her notebook and making her the center of attention, while he apologized with that fake concern that was somehow worse than open cruelty. She'd requested a bathroom pass and just kept walking straight to her car, unable to stomach another minute in that classroom. "Thanks." She took the paper, expecting him to leave. Instead, Julian leaned back in his chair, studying her with those dark eyes that seemed to see past the careful walls she'd built. "That guy's a dick." "What guy?" Senna's heart rate sped up despite her best efforts to stay calm. "Bryce Callahan. He's a dick. Always has been." Julian said it matter-of-factly, like he was commenting on the weather. "Don't let him get to you. He gets bored eventually." Senna wanted to believe that, but 4 weeks of escalating harassment suggested otherwise. Still, there was something in Julian's expression, not pity, which she couldn't have tolerated, but genuine concern, maybe even recognition, like he understood what it was like to be on the receiving end of that kind of focused cruelty. "I'm not letting him get to me." The lie tasted bitter. "Yeah." Julian's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile. "Then why do you look like you want to punch someone through a wall every time he walks past you?" The observation was so accurate that Senna felt exposed, like he'd somehow seen through her carefully maintained facade to the truth underneath, that she was barely holding herself together, that every day required monumental effort not to show exactly what she was capable of doing. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Right." Julian stood up, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. "Look, if you ever want to talk or whatever, I'm around. The library's pretty much my second home." He paused, then added, "And for what it's worth, standing up to him wouldn't make you like him. Some people need to get knocked down a peg or two, just saying." He left before Senna could formulate a response, leaving her staring at the empty chair and trying to process what had just happened. Someone had noticed. Someone had seen what was happening and bothered to say something, to acknowledge it, to suggest that maybe she wasn't crazy for wanting to fight back. The realization created a dangerous crack in the armor she'd been maintaining, a vulnerability she couldn't afford. Over the next 2 weeks, Julian kept appearing in her orbit, not pushy, but consistently present. He'd sit at the next table over during lunch if she was in the cafeteria, a silent backup that made it harder for Bryce's crew to corner her completely. He'd fall into step with her in the hallway between classes sometimes, talking about bands she'd never heard of, or books he was reading, or his theory about why the school's pizza tasted like cardboard. He never asked about the bullying directly, never forced her to acknowledge what was happening, but his presence was a statement in itself. "You're not alone." Senna found herself responding despite her better judgment. Julian was easy to talk to, genuinely interested in her opinions about music and movies, and whether dystopian fiction was a reflection of societal anxiety or just good entertainment. He introduced her to his friend group, a loose collection of band kids, artists, and theater people who existed outside the mainstream social hierarchy and didn't seem to care about Bryce Callahan's approval. For the first time since arriving at Lincoln High, Senna felt like she could breathe, like there might be more to this school than just survival. And Bryce noticed. Week 7 started with a shift in tactics. The harassment didn't stop, but now it included Julian. Bryce would accidentally bump into him in the hallway, knocking his guitar case from his shoulder. Connor started spreading rumors that Julian and Senna were dating, coupling it with crude sexual comments that made Senna's face burn. Tyler began a whisper campaign, suggesting Julian was only hanging around Senna because he had a fetish for ethnic girls, a racist comment that was both insulting to her and to him. Senna watched it happen with growing horror and guilt. This was exactly what she'd been trying to avoid, bringing someone else into her nightmare, making them a target. She'd tried to distance herself from Julian, eating lunch in her car again, avoiding the library, taking different routes between classes. But Julian wasn't having it. He'd shown up at her car window during lunch, tapping on the glass until she rolled it down. "What are you doing?" His tone was more exasperated than angry. "Eating lunch." "What does it look like?" Senna kept her eyes on her sandwich, unable to meet his gaze. "It looks like you're hiding because you think I can't handle some idiot football player giving me shit." Julian crouched down so they were eye level, his expression serious. "I've been dealing with Bryce since middle school. This isn't new for me. It's different now." Senna's throat felt tight. "He's targeting you because of me. That's not fair. Life's not fair. Shocking revelation." Julian's tone was dry. "Look, I'm not some damsel who needs protecting. I chose to be your friend because I wanted to, not because I'm too stupid to know what I was getting into. So stop trying to push me away and just let me be your friend, okay?" The simplicity of it, the direct honesty, cracked something open in Senna's chest. She'd been alone for so long, carrying everything by herself, convinced that isolation was the only way to keep her promise. But Julian was choosing to stand next to her, knowing the cost, and turning him away felt like another kind of cowardice. "Okay." The word came out barely above a whisper. "Okay." Julian grinned. "Good. Now come eat lunch at an actual table like a normal person. My friends want to meet you properly." So Senna started spending lunch with Julian and his crew, Grace, who played violin and had a wicked sense of humor, Devon, who was planning to study film and narrated everything like it was a movie, and Priya, who was captain of the debate team and could argue any position brilliantly. They adopted Senna into their group with an ease that felt almost foreign, including her in conversations, laughing at her jokes, treating her like she'd always been there. For the first time in weeks, Senna allowed herself to relax, to let her guard down just a little, to remember what it felt like to be part of something. And that's when Bryce escalated. The incident in the gymnasium happened on a Wednesday afternoon during the period when it was usually empty, between when gym classes ended and when sports practices began. Senna had forgotten her chemistry textbook and had permission to go back to her locker, which required cutting through the gym to get to the science wing faster. The space was cavernous and dim, with only half the overhead lights on, the polished wood floor reflecting dull amber light. Bleachers lined both sides, rolled up tight against the walls, and basketball hoops hung at either end like silent judges. The air smelled of sweat and floor wax and the rubber from thousands of sneakers. She was halfway across the floor when she heard voices echoing from the locker room entrance. Bryce, Connor, and Marcus emerged, and Senna's stomach dropped. Wrong place, wrong time, no witnesses, no way out except past them. She kept walking, keeping her pace steady, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. Well, well, look who's here all by herself. Bryce's voice echoed in the empty space, and the three of them spread out slightly, blocking the exit without making it obvious. "Where's your boyfriend?" You two usually attached at the hip. "He's not my boyfriend." "Excuse me." Senna tried to walk past, but Connor stepped into her path. "Dude, I'm talking to you." It's rude to walk away. Bryce moved closer, and Senna could smell his cologne, something expensive and overwhelming. "You know, I've been thinking. You and Torres together is kind of funny. Neither of you really belong here, right? I mean, with your whole situation and his wannabe rock star thing. Maybe you two should just leave Lincoln together, find somewhere that actually wants you." The insult was designed to sting, to make her feel small and foreign and wrong, and it worked. But underneath the hurt was something else building. A pressure that had been accumulating for 7 weeks, compressed tighter and tighter until it had nowhere left to go. Senna's hands curled into fists at her sides, and she met Bryce's eyes directly for the first time in weeks. "Get out of my way." Something in her tone must have registered, because Bryce's smirk faltered for just a second before coming back stronger. "Or what? You'll tell a teacher? Good luck with that. Nobody cares what happens to—" He reached out to shove her shoulder, a dismissive gesture meant to reinforce his dominance, and Senna's body reacted on pure instinct. Her hand came up and caught his wrist, redirecting the force of his push downward and to the side, while her other hand secured his elbow, executing a basic joint lock that had him bent forward with his arm hyperextended before he even registered what was happening. She could feel the exact point where she'd need to apply just a bit more pressure to dislocate his shoulder, felt his weight distribution shift as he tried unsuccessfully to pull away, and for one glorious second, Senna held all the power. Then she remembered. Her mother's voice, that final conversation, the promise. She released him immediately and stepped back, her heart hammering, hands shaking with adrenaline. Bryce stumbled, caught himself, and turned to stare at her with an expression that cycled rapidly through shock, confusion, and something that might have been fear before landing on rage. "Did you just—" He looked at his friends as if seeking confirmation that what just happened had actually happened. "Did this bitch just grab me?" Connor and Marcus moved in immediately, but Senna was already backing toward the exit, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Sorry, reflex, just leave me alone." She turned and walked away as fast as she could without running, feeling their eyes burning into her back, knowing that everything had just changed. She'd shown them a glimpse of what she could do, and that made her more dangerous, more threatening, and infinitely more targeted. The rest of that day passed in a haze of anxiety. Senna couldn't focus in class, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything except the look on Bryce's face when she'd locked his arm. He'd been genuinely surprised, had actually felt threatened for a moment, and guys like Bryce didn't handle perceived threats well. They eliminated them. Julian found her after school in the parking lot, where she was sitting in her car with the windows down, trying to calm her breathing. He knocked on the doorframe and waited until she looked at him. "You okay?" "You seemed off in English." "I'm fine." The automatic lie came out, but Julian just raised an eyebrow. "Right, and I'm actually the Queen of England." He glanced around the mostly empty parking lot, then looked back at her. "Want to go get coffee or something? Get off campus for a bit?" Senna should have said no, should have maintained the distance, protected him from what was coming, dealt with everything alone. But she was so tired of being alone, so exhausted from carrying everything by herself, that she found herself nodding. "Yeah, okay." They went to a small coffee shop 3 blocks from school, one of those local places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls, and a chalkboard menu that changed daily. Julian ordered some complicated espresso drink while Senna got black coffee, and they claimed a table by the window where they could watch people walking past. For a few minutes they just sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who don't feel the need to fill every moment with words. "So," Julian finally said, wrapping his hands around his cup. "Are you going to tell me what happened today, or am I going to have to guess?" Senna studied his face, trying to decide how much to reveal, how much he could handle knowing. "I did something stupid. Something that's going to make everything worse." "Define stupid." Julian's tone was curious, not judgmental. "I... Senna paused, trying to find words that wouldn't reveal too much. "Bryce tried to push me in the gym, and I stopped him. Caught his arm. He wasn't expecting it. Understanding dawned in Julian's expression, followed by something that might have been respect. "You know how to fight." It wasn't a question. Senna's silence was answer enough. She stared into her coffee, watching the way the light reflected off the dark surface, fracturing into tiny fragments. "I promised someone I wouldn't. Promised I'd walk away, not engage, not become—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "Not become what?" Julian leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Not become my father." The words came out before she could stop them, and once they were out, the rest followed in a rush she couldn't control. She told him about her dad, about the violence that had defined his life, about watching him get progressively more brutal until it consumed him completely. About her mother's desperate attempt to keep Senna from following that same path. About Uncle Marcus's gym in Phoenix, and the 3 years she'd spent learning to channel rage into discipline, fear into power, grief into devastating combinations that could drop someone twice her size, about the promise she'd made and the terrible effort it took every single day to keep it. When she finished, the coffee shop felt too quiet, and Senna couldn't bring herself to look at Julian, couldn't bear to see disgust or fear or pity in his expression. But when she finally forced herself to meet his eyes, what she saw instead was understanding mixed with something else. Concern, maybe, but also a kind of fierce determination. "You know what I think," Julian said quietly. "I think your mum didn't want you to become a bully or someone who hurts people for fun. I think she wanted you to be better than your dad. But defending yourself, standing up to actual bullies, that's not the same thing as becoming your father. That's just refusing to be a victim." "You don't understand." Senna shook her head. "Once I start, I might not stop. Violence is it's like a drug for me. The adrenaline, the clarity, the power. It feels good, and that's what scares me. That's what scared my mom. She knew I was good at it, maybe too good, and she'd seen what happened when my dad got good at hurting people. It became all he knew. But you're not him." Julian's voice was firm. "You've been getting harassed for 7 weeks, and you haven't hurt anyone. You had Bryce in a lock and you let him go. That's restraint. That's control. That's exactly what your mom wanted, isn't it? To have the power but choose not to use it." The observation struck something deep in Senna's chest, a realization she'd been dancing around for weeks. Maybe keeping her promise didn't mean being passive. Maybe it meant having the strength to defend herself without losing herself in the process. But that was a dangerous line to walk, and she wasn't sure she could trust herself to maintain the balance. Doesn't matter now. Senna drained the last of her coffee. Bryce knows I'm not helpless. He's not going to let that stand. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Then maybe it needs to get worse. Julian's expression was serious. Maybe he needs to learn that some people push back. That's what I'm afraid of. But Senna didn't explain further, and Julian didn't push. They drove back to school separately, and Senna spent the rest of the evening at home, in the tiny apartment she shared with Aunt Rosa, trying to focus on homework while her thoughts spun in circles. Her aunt was a night shift nurse, gone from 8 p.m. until 8 a.m., which meant Senna had long hours alone to think, to train secretly in the small space between her bed and the wall, to feel her body remember movements it hadn't been allowed to execute fully in months. She ran through combinations in slow motion, feeling the perfect rotation of her hips as she threw a roundhouse kick, the snap of her knee extending, the pull in her core muscles as she pivoted. The discipline was still there, the training burned into muscle memory so deep it might as well be instinct. But muscle memory wasn't the same thing as permission, and Senna found herself back in the same loop of thought she'd been trapped in since arriving at Lincoln. Keep the promise, or stand up for herself. Honor her mother's dying wish, or defend her own dignity. Be who she was trained to be, or become someone her mother wouldn't recognize. She didn't have an answer by the time she fell asleep, and she woke up on Thursday morning with a sense of dread sitting heavy in her chest like a stone. The escalation came during lunch. Senna was sitting with Julian and his friends at their usual table, halfway through a discussion about whether classic rock was actually good or just nostalgia, when Bryce and his entire crew descended on them like a storm system. There were more of them than usual, not just the core four, but another 6 or 7 guys who played football or wrestled, creating a circle of intimidation around their table. Other students noticed immediately, conversations dying off as attention shifted to the brewing confrontation. Torres! Bryce's voice carried across the cafeteria, pitched loud enough to make sure everyone could hear. I'm surprised you're still hanging around this freak. Thought you had better taste than to go slumming with trash. Julian stood up slowly, and Senna's stomach dropped. Walk away, Bryce. We're not doing this. I'm not talking to you. Bryce's eyes locked on Senna, who remained seated, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to stand up, to square her shoulders, to prepare for what was coming. I'm talking to your little girlfriend here, or boyfriend, whatever she is. You know, I've been thinking. Someone who puts their hands on me needs to learn some manners. I didn't, Senna started to say, but Connor cut her off. You grabbed him. That's assault. That's serious shit. Connor was playing the part of reasonable enforcer, and other students were nodding along, buying into the narrative being constructed. You can't just go around putting your hands on people. The irony was so thick Senna nearly laughed. She wanted to stand up and scream at all of them, wanted to point out that Bryce had been putting his hands on her for 2 months, that he'd dumped chocolate milk over her head, that he'd shoved her into lockers and destroyed her property and made her life hell. But she could see from the expressions around her that it wouldn't matter. Bryce was popular, protected, believed. She was nobody, nothing, the new girl who dared to grab the golden boy's wrist. Here's what's going to happen. Bryce stepped closer to the table, and Senna forced herself to remain seated, to keep her breathing even. You're going to apologize. Right here, in front of everyone. Get down on your knees and apologize for thinking you could put your hands on me. The cafeteria had gone almost silent now. Hundreds of students watching, phones out and recording, waiting to see what would happen. Grace made a sound of protest, and Priya started to stand up, but Senna shook her head slightly. This was her problem, her fight, and she wouldn't let her new friends get hurt trying to defend her. No. The word came out clear and steady, and Senna saw Bryce's expression flicker with surprise. She stood up slowly, facing him directly, and for the first time in 2 months, she didn't drop her gaze. "I'm not apologizing for defending myself. You tried to shove me. I stopped you. That's all that happened. That's not all that's going to happen." Bryce's face flushed red, the kind of anger that comes from being challenged publicly and not knowing how to handle it. "You think you're tough? You think you can just disrespect me in my school? I think you're a bully who's never been told no." Senna's voice carried across the silent cafeteria, and she saw people's expressions shift, saw the calculation happening as they reassessed the situation. "I think you pick on people because your daddy expects you to be perfect and you're terrified of failing. I think you treat people like garbage because it's the only way you know how to feel powerful, and I think you know, deep down, that you're not nearly as special as everyone tells you you are." The psychological analysis was dead accurate. She could see it in the way Bryce's face went white, then red, the way his fists clenched at his sides. She'd struck directly at the insecurity that drove all of his behavior, the desperate need to maintain his image and status, and done it in front of an audience that would remember every word. It was a verbal kill shot, and everyone knew it. "You bitch!" Bryce lunged forward, and Senna's body reacted before her mind could engage. She stepped offline, creating an angle, and Bryce stumbled past her into the table, but he recovered quickly, rage overriding caution, and grabbed for her arm. His fingers closed around her wrist, and time seemed to slow down. This was the moment, the decision point. She could let him grab her, let him humiliate her, maintain her promise and her passive stance. Or she could act. Senna moved. She rotated her wrist in the direction his thumb was pointed, breaking his grip easily, then secured his wrist with her own hand while stepping in close to control his body positioning. It was basic self-defense, the kind of thing you'd teach to someone in their first month of training, but executed with a precision that came from thousands of hours of practice. She could feel exactly where his weight was distributed, could sense the trajectory of his attempted counter, and she checked it by applying pressure to his wrist while shifting her hip to block his forward motion. For 3 heartbeats, she held him there, not hurting him, just controlling him, demonstrating that she could do what he'd been trying to do to her for months. Bryce struggled, realized he couldn't break free, and his eyes widened with genuine fear. Senna saw it, felt a surge of satisfaction that was equal parts vindication and power, and that scared her more than anything. This feeling, this rush of having someone completely at her mercy, this was what her father must have felt every time he used his fists. This was the addiction her mother had warned her about. She released him immediately and stepped back, hands raised. "I don't want to fight you. Just leave me alone." Bryce stumbled, caught his balance, and Senna saw the moment the fear transformed into humiliated rage. He'd been shown up twice now, both times in front of witnesses, and his entire social structure was built on a foundation of dominance that was now cracking. He couldn't let this stand. He had to re-establish control, had to prove he was still the alpha, still the one with power. "This isn't over." His voice shook slightly. "Not even close." He left, his crew following, and the cafeteria slowly came back to life with a roar of conversation. Everyone was talking about what had just happened, phones out, already posting to social media, turning the incident into legend. Senna sat down heavily, her legs suddenly weak, adrenaline making her hands shake. Julian sat down next to her, his expression a mixture of concern and something that might have been pride. "That was either really brave or really stupid. I can't decide which." "Both." Senna's voice came out unsteady. "Definitely both." "Did you see his face?" Grace was grinning. He looked like he was going to cry. He's not going to cry. Priya's voice was serious. He's going to retaliate. People like Bryce can't handle being humiliated. He's going to come back harder. Let him. Devon was still filming on his phone. The whole thing's on video. She didn't do anything wrong, pure self-defense. But Senna knew it wouldn't matter. Facts and video evidence and self-defense claims meant nothing when you were up against someone whose father sat on the city council and whose mother could get teachers fired with a phone call. Bryce had resources and connections and the entire weight of Lincoln High's social structure behind him. She had skill and rage and a promise she was struggling to keep. The rest of that day passed in a blur. Teachers had obviously heard about the cafeteria incident because several of them pulled Senna aside with expressions that ranged from concern to poorly disguised excitement at the drama. None of them asked if she was okay. None of them seemed to care that she'd been getting harassed for months before finally defending herself. They just wanted to make sure she understood that violence wasn't tolerated at Lincoln High, and she should come to them if she felt threatened, conveniently forgetting that she'd done exactly that weeks ago and been dismissed. Friday brought a new form of harassment, complete social isolation. Bryce must have spread the word because suddenly nobody was willing to sit near her in class. People moved away when she approached. Conversations died when she entered a room. It was like she'd been marked with some kind of social plague, and everyone was afraid contact would infect them. Even Julian's friend group seemed subdued, still friendly but wary, aware that association with Senna carried risks they hadn't fully considered before. The weekend provided a brief respite, but Senna spent most of it in a state of anxious anticipation, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Aunt Rosa noticed something was wrong but didn't push, just made Senna's favorite foods and gave her space to process whatever was happening. On Sunday night, Senna received a text from Julian. He's planning something big. Heard Connor talking about Monday. Be careful. Monday arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that comes right before a storm. Senna could feel the tension in the air the moment she walked into school, could see it in the way people watched her, in the clusters of students whispering and looking at their phones. Something had happened, something had been set in motion, and she was walking into it blind. The morning passed uneventfully, which only made Senna more nervous. She kept waiting for Bryce to make his move, but he was nowhere to be seen. Connor and Marcus were in their usual spots, but they just watched her with expressions that might have been anticipation or might have been pity. By lunchtime, Senna's nerves were stretched so tight she felt like she might snap. She was walking through the main hallway toward the cafeteria, moving against the flow of students all heading in the same direction, when she heard Julian's voice calling her name. She turned to see him pushing through the crowd, his expression urgent. "Don't go to lunch." He grabbed her arm when he reached her. "Bryce is planning something. I don't know what, but whatever it is, it's happening in the cafeteria. Then I'm definitely going." Senna's voice was calm, resigned. "If I hide, it just gets worse. If I run, I'm giving him exactly what he wants." "Senna," Julian started to protest, but she was already moving toward the cafeteria, and he fell into step beside her because that's who he was. Someone who wouldn't let her face things alone, even when she wanted to. The cafeteria was unusually crowded for this early, with students clustered around the entrance and spilling out into the hallway. Senna could hear laughter and shouting, could feel the electric buzz of crowd excitement that comes right before something terrible happens. She pushed through to the entrance and stopped dead. In the center of the cafeteria, set up on one of the tables like some kind of shrine, was a massive poster board covered with printed photos. Photos of Senna. Photoshopped images showing her face on pornographic bodies, crude sexual scenarios, images designed to humiliate and degrade. Her face burning, blood roaring in her ears, Senna forced herself to look at what Bryce had created. Around the poster were printed copies of the fake social media profiles, complete with made-up quotes attributed to her, sexual confessions, racist statements, insults directed at other students. It was comprehensive character assassination, public humiliation, designed to destroy whatever social standing she might have built. Bryce stood next to his creation, arms crossed, surrounded by his crew and at least 20 other students who were filming the spectacle. When he saw Senna, his smile widened. There she is. Everyone say hi to Lincoln High's newest celebrity. The crowd parted as Senna walked forward, Julian close behind her, and she could feel hundreds of eyes on her, could hear the whispered comments and cruel laughter. This was the moment Bryce had been building toward, the ultimate power play. Public humiliation so complete that she'd have no choice but to leave Lincoln, to disappear, to let him win. She stood in front of the poster, staring at her own face twisted into degrading scenarios, and something inside her crystallized into diamond-hard clarity. This wasn't about defending herself anymore. This wasn't about keeping promises or avoiding violence. This was about basic human dignity, about drawing a line and saying no further. Her mother would have understood. Her mother would have known that there's a difference between becoming a bully and refusing to be destroyed by one. Senna turned to face Bryce, and the expression on her face must have communicated something because his smile faltered slightly. You done? Her voice carried across the cafeteria, clear and cold. I don't know, are you? Bryce gestured at the poster. I mean, I could probably make more. Really get creative with it, unless you want to do what I said before. Get on your knees, apologize, and maybe I'll take it down. The crowd was recording everything, phones held high, capturing every moment for posterity and social media clout. Teachers were starting to arrive, drawn by the commotion, but they stopped at the periphery, watching, not intervening. Everyone wanted to see how this would play out. No, Senna's voice was steady. I'm not apologizing, and I'm not running, and I'm done pretending you have power over me. That's cute. Bryce stepped closer, and his friends moved with him, creating a circle of intimidation. You think because you know some basic self-defense moves that makes you tough? You grabbed my wrist twice. Lucky shots. But you're still nothing. You're still the weird new girl who doesn't belong here. And after today, everyone's going to know exactly what you are. And what's that? Senna asked quietly. Trash. Bryce reached out, not to grab her, but to shove her shoulder dismissively, the same gesture he'd tried in the gym. You're His hand never made contact. Senna moved, and suddenly Bryce was on the ground, his legs swept out from under him so fast he didn't have time to break his fall. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath, and in the silence that followed, Senna stood over him, with her hands at her sides, not in fists, just ready. Get up. Her voice cut through the silence. You want to prove I'm nothing? Then prove it, right now. No tricks, no friends, just you and me. Show everyone here who's trash and who's not. Bryce scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. This was happening in front of the entire school, being recorded from a dozen angles, and he had no choice but to accept the challenge or lose everything. You're going to regret this. Maybe. Senna's stance shifted subtly, weight distributed perfectly, hands coming up into a guard position that anyone with martial arts training would recognize immediately as serious. But you're definitely going to... What happened next would be replayed on social media thousands of times, analyzed frame by frame, turned into legend and cautionary tale. Bryce threw a wild right hook, telegraphing the punch so obviously that Senna had time to slip it, angle offline, and counter with a straight right to his solar plexus that folded him forward, gasping for air. She didn't follow up, didn't press the advantage, just reset her stance and waited. Connor moved in from the side, trying to grab her in a clinch, and Senna's body went into autopilot. 3 years of training activated all at once, muscle memory taking over, and she executed a perfect hip throw that sent Connor crashing into a table. Marcus tried next, coming in low for a tackle, and Senna dropped her weight, sprawled her legs back to counter the takedown, then secured an underhook and redirected his momentum so he stumbled past her into Connor. The crowd was going insane now, screaming and cheering, but Senna barely heard them. She was in the zone, that crystalline state of perfect awareness where time slowed down and everything became clear. Tyler rushed her from behind. She sensed him coming more than saw him, felt the displacement of air, and executed a backward kick that caught him in the midsection and sent him stumbling back into the crowd of onlookers. Bryce had recovered enough to try again, this time attempting a clumsy grapple, and Senna responded with a level of precision that demonstrated exactly how much she'd been holding back. She secured his collar with one hand, controlled his posture, and swept his legs while pulling him down, executing a textbook sacrifice throw that put him on his back, with her kneeling beside him in a dominant position. She could have transitioned to mount, could have rained down punches, could have made him beg her to stop. Instead, she stood up and stepped back. Stay down. But Bryce wasn't done. Humiliation and rage had overridden whatever survival instinct he had left, and he came at her one more time, throwing a series of wild punches that Senna parried or slipped with minimal effort. She could see the exhaustion setting in, could see that he was running on pure adrenaline and ego, could see the exact moment when she'd broken his will to fight. His last punch came in slow and desperate, and Senna caught his wrist, applied a standing armbar that hyperextended his elbow joint just enough to hurt without injuring, and walked him backward until his shoulders hit the cafeteria wall. "I could break your arm right now." Senna's voice was low enough that only Bryce could hear it over the roaring crowd. "I could dislocate your shoulder, fracture your elbow, put you in the hospital. That's what you think I am, right? Violent, trashy, someone who solves problems with fists." She applied slightly more pressure and felt him try to pull away, felt his fear spike. "But I'm not going to." "You know why?" "Fuck you." Bryce's voice shook. "Because I'm better than you." Senna released him and stepped back, her hands dropping to her sides. "I'm better than your father's money, better than your football scholarship, better than every advantage you've ever had that made you think you could treat people like garbage. I'm better because I had the power to hurt you, and I chose not to. Can you say the same?" The silence in the cafeteria was absolute. Hundreds of students stood frozen, phones still recording, bearing witness to something they'd never seen before, a bully not just defeated, but morally dismantled. Bryce slid down the wall, holding his arm, his face a study in shock and shame and broken arrogance. Connor and Marcus weren't getting up. Tyler had disappeared into the crowd, and Senna stood in the center of it all, breathing hard but steady, her hands still not formed into fists. Then someone started clapping, slow, deliberate applause that came from somewhere in the crowd, and suddenly others joined in until the entire cafeteria was filled with the sound of applause and cheering. Not because they loved Senna, not because she'd become their hero, but because they'd witnessed the impossible, someone standing up to the system that had oppressed them all and winning through sheer force of will and skill. The teachers finally moved in, pushing through the crowd, voices raised, demanding order. Mrs. Henderson, the vice principal, arrived with 2 security guards, her expression grim. "Everyone clear out. Now! Miss Ashford, Mr. Callahan, you both need to come with me immediately." Senna walked toward the exit, and the crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. She could feel their eyes on her, could hear the whispered conversations, could sense that everything had changed. Julian met her near the entrance, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. He seemed unable to find words. I know. Senna's adrenaline was crashing, leaving her shaky and slightly nauseated. I know. The vice principal's office was a windowless room with harsh fluorescent lighting that made Senna's eyes water, furnished with a metal desk, 3 uncomfortable plastic chairs, and walls covered with motivational posters about achievement and responsibility that felt grotesquely ironic given the circumstances. Mrs. Henderson sat behind her desk with Senna on one side and Bryce on the other, both of them silent while she reviewed the multiple videos of the cafeteria fight on her tablet. Security guards stood by the door, ostensibly to maintain order, but really to serve as implicit threat. Nobody was leaving until this got sorted out. Miss Ashford. Mrs. Henderson finally looked up, her expression unreadable. Lincoln High has a zero-tolerance policy regarding physical violence. You're aware of this? Yes, ma'am. Senna kept her voice level, respectful, giving them no ammunition to use against her. Then perhaps you can explain why you chose to assault 4 of your fellow students in the cafeteria in front of the entire school. The question was loaded, designed to get Senna to incriminate herself. Self-defense isn't assault. Senna met the vice principal's eyes directly. Bryce has been harassing me since my first week here. Him and his friends. They destroyed my locker, dumped food on me, spread lies about me, created fake social media accounts, and today they set up that poster designed to humiliate me. All of that is documented. Other students saw it. There are videos of most of it. I've reported some of it to the office, but nothing was done. Mrs. Henderson's expression tightened slightly. If you felt threatened, you should have come to us. I did come to you. Senna's voice remained calm but firm. 3 weeks ago, after my locker was vandalized, I was told you'd look into it. Nothing happened. The harassment continued and escalated. When Bryce physically threatened me today, I defended myself using minimal necessary force. I never struck first, never used excessive force, and I stopped as soon as the threat was neutralized. That's textbook self-defense. You threw 3 students and put Mr. Callahan in an arm lock. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried a note of incredulity. Where exactly did you learn to do that? I trained for 3 years in Phoenix. Senna saw no point in lying now. Kickboxing, Muay Thai, and some Brazilian jiu-jitsu. My uncle owns a gym. It was therapy after my mother died. And you didn't think to mention this when you enrolled. The vice principal's tone suggested this was somehow Senna's fault for not warning them she knew how to defend herself. I didn't think it was relevant. Senna kept her voice neutral. I came here to get an education, not to fight. I've spent 2 months avoiding confrontation, ignoring harassment, trying to keep my head down. I defended myself only when I had no other option, and someone put their hands on me first. Every video will show that. Bryce had been silent throughout this exchange, but now he spoke up, his voice rough. She's been asking for it since she got here. Walking around like she owns the place, acting superior. I literally never spoke to you until you started harassing me. Senna cut him off, her patience finally fraying. I came to this school trying to disappear, and you decided to make me your project. You decided that humiliating me would be fun. You created those posters, spread those lies, recruited your friends to make my life hell. And when I finally stood up for myself, you couldn't handle it. That's on you, not me. That's enough. Mrs. Henderson held up a hand. Mr. Callahan, you're suspended pending a full investigation into the harassment allegations. Miss Ashford, you're also suspended while we determine if your response was proportional to the threat. Both of you can collect your belongings and leave campus immediately. Your parents will be contacted. Senna felt the injustice of it, like a physical blow. She was being punished for defending herself, lumped in with her harasser as if they were equally culpable, treated like the problem instead of the victim who'd finally had enough. But arguing would only make things worse, so she stood up, kept her expression neutral, and walked out of the office with her head high. Julian was waiting in the hallway, along with Grace, Devon, and Priya. They surrounded her immediately, offering support, expressing outrage, promising to give statements about the harassment they'd witnessed. Julian pulled her aside, his expression serious. "My dad's a lawyer. He does some civil rights work. I already texted him. He wants to talk to you about potential discrimination and harassment claims against the school." "I can't afford a lawyer." Senna's voice was flat. "He'll do it pro bono. He hates bullies." Julian smiled slightly. "And apparently my description of what you did in the cafeteria impressed him. He said anyone with that much restraint while under attack is someone worth defending." Senna felt something crack open in her chest, some tight knot of isolation and fear that had been there since Phoenix. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Julian's expression turned serious. "This is going to get worse before it gets better. Bryce's parents are going to lawyer up, try to flip the narrative, make you the aggressor. The school's going to want to sweep it under the rug to protect their reputation. You need to be ready for a fight, a legal one this time." "I'm ready." And Senna realized she meant it. She'd spent 2 months being passive, being the victim, trying to honor a promise that her mother would have modified if she'd known the circumstances. Standing up to Bryce hadn't made her a bully. It had made her free. The suspension lasted 2 weeks while the school conducted its investigation, during which time Senna's video-recorded fight became a viral sensation. Someone had posted it to TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram, and it had spread like wildfire. She was getting messages from strangers, some supportive, some critical, many wanting to know where she'd trained and if she'd teach them. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as everything from girl defeats bully to school violence epidemic, depending on their editorial slant. Senna ignored all of it, focused on working with Julian's father to build a comprehensive case documenting the harassment she'd endured. The evidence was overwhelming. Security camera footage showed multiple incidents of Bryce and his friends targeting her, screenshots of the fake social media accounts, complete with metadata proving when they'd been created, text messages from anonymous numbers that could be traced, witness statements from students who'd seen the harassment but been too afraid to intervene. The poster itself, with its degrading photoshopped images, constituted sexual harassment and possibly defamation, medical records showing the bruises from being shoved into lockers. When the school board finally held its hearing, Senna walked into the conference room with Julian's father, David Torres, a sharp-dressed man with kind eyes who specialized in education law. Across the table sat Bryce and his parents, his father every bit the politician Senna had expected, his mother thin and elegant and radiating disapproval. The school's lawyer was there, along with Mrs. Henderson and Principal Jacobs, who'd been conveniently absent throughout the investigation. The hearing lasted 3 hours. David Torres presented the evidence methodically, building an irrefutable case of systematic harassment, institutional failure to protect a student, and discriminatory discipline practices. He showed the videos of Senna defending herself, pointing out the clear self-defense markers, the restraint she'd shown, the multiple opportunities she'd had to severely injure Bryce, but had chosen not to take. He quoted case law, cited Title IX violations, and made it clear that if the school didn't handle this appropriately, he'd be filing in civil court. Bryce's father tried to argue that his son had been the real victim, that Senna's excessive force had been unjustified, that she should be expelled for bringing violence to Lincoln High. But the evidence was too overwhelming, and David Torres destroyed each argument with the calm precision of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms. When Bryce's mother tried to suggest that Senna had somehow provoked the harassment, David simply played the video of the poster board with its sexually explicit images and asked if she was suggesting her son's response to perceived provocation was appropriate. The school board ruled in Senna's favor. Bryce was suspended for the remainder of the semester, required to attend counseling, and placed on probation for his final year. Connor, Marcus, and Tyler received similar punishments. The fake social media accounts were scrubbed from the internet. The school implemented new anti-bullying policies and mandatory training for staff on intervention procedures. And Senna's suspension was removed from her record, replaced with a notation that she'd acted in self-defense. It was as close to justice as she was going to get, and while it didn't erase the trauma of those first 2 months, it validated that what she'd experienced was real and wrong and not her fault. When Senna returned to Lincoln High after the 2-week suspension, she walked through the front doors with Julian by her side and her head held high. The atmosphere was completely different. Students nodded as she passed, some offering quiet words of support, others just acknowledging her presence with respect. The hallways that had felt like running a gauntlet now felt navigable. Teachers who'd pretended not to see her harassment now went out of their way to check in on her, to ensure she had what she needed, guilty about their previous inaction. Her first class was English with Mrs. Patterson, and when Senna walked in, the room fell silent. Then someone started a slow clap, not mocking but genuinely acknowledging her presence. Others joined in until the whole class was applauding, and Mrs. Patterson didn't stop them. When the applause died down, Mrs. Patterson simply said, "Welcome back, Senna. We're glad you're here." Lunch was different too. Senna sat with Julian and his friends at their usual table, but they were joined by other students, some of the ones who'd been Bryce's victims, others who just wanted to be around someone who'd stood up to the system. The cafeteria still had its social hierarchies, but there was a new awareness, a sense that things could change if people were willing to push back. Grace leaned across the table, her expression curious. "So, are you going to, teach self-defense classes or something? Because half the girls in school want to learn how you did that." "I don't know." Senna considered the question seriously. "Maybe. If I could teach people to defend themselves without becoming bullies themselves, that would be worth doing. There's a difference between knowing how to fight and being a fighter." Julian's voice was thoughtful. "You proved that. You had every opportunity to seriously hurt Bryce, and you chose not to. That's what people remember most about the video. Not that you won, but that you showed mercy." The observation settled into Senna's mind like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. That was the lesson her mother had been trying to teach her, the wisdom that her father had never learned. Power without restraint is tyranny. Strength without compassion is brutality. Knowing how to hurt someone and choosing not to is the highest form of strength. The weeks following her return established a new normal. Bryce returned after his suspension a different person, quieter, more careful, avoiding eye contact with most people, and especially with Senna. She'd see him sometimes in the hallway, usually alone now since Connor and Marcus were keeping their distance, and he looked smaller somehow, diminished. His throne at the top of Lincoln High's social hierarchy had been dismantled, and he was learning what it felt like to be just another student without power or protection. 3 weeks after her return, Senna was in the library working on a paper when Bryce appeared at her table. She tensed automatically, her body preparing for threat, but he held his hands up in a placating gesture and stayed a careful distance away. "Can I talk to you?" His voice was uncertain, nothing like the cocky arrogance he'd displayed before. Senna gestured to the chair across from her, wary but willing to hear him out. Julian was at the next table over, close enough to intervene if necessary, and the librarian was watching from her desk. Bryce sat down carefully, like he was approaching a wild animal that might bolt. "I wanted to apologize." The words came out stiff, clearly rehearsed, but there was something underneath them that might have been genuine. "For everything, the harassment, the poster, all of it. What I did was wrong and you didn't deserve any of it." Senna studied his face, looking for the angle, the manipulation, the trap, but what she saw instead was exhaustion and shame, and something that might have been the beginning of self-awareness. "Why did you do it?" She kept her voice neutral. "Honestly?" Bryce looked down at his hands. "Because I could. Because making other people feel small made me feel big. Because my dad's been on my ass about football and grades and being perfect since I was like 10, and taking it out on someone else was easier than dealing with my own shit." He paused. "And because when I saw you didn't react, didn't fight back, I thought you were weak. I thought I could do whatever I wanted and you'd just take it." "And now?" Senna asked. "Now I know you're not weak. You're stronger than me, stronger than anyone I know." Bryce met her eyes briefly, then looked away. "You could have destroyed me that day in the cafeteria, put me in the hospital, and you didn't. You showed mercy. I don't know if I would have done the same." "That's the difference between us." Senna's voice was quiet. "I don't want to destroy people. I just want to exist without being destroyed." "I get that now." Bryce stood up slowly. "I'm in therapy. My parents are making me go, but honestly, I think I need it. My therapist says I've been acting out trauma from my own shit, projecting whatever. I don't know if that's true, but I'm trying to figure it out." He hesitated. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve that. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and I'm trying to be different." Senna considered him for a long moment. This was what accountability looked like, not perfect, not easy, but genuine. "I don't forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. What you did caused real damage, and sorry doesn't undo that. But I believe you're trying to change, and that's a start. Don't backslide. Don't fall into old patterns. Actually be better." "I will." Bryce nodded. "Or I'll try anyway." He left without another word, and Senna watched him go, feeling complicated emotions she couldn't quite name. Relief that the chapter was closing. Satisfaction that he was facing consequences. And something that might have been hope that people really could change if they chose to. Julian moved to her table once Bryce was gone, sliding into the chair across from her. "That took courage, talking to you like that. It took courage for me not to hit him." Senna said it lightly, but they both knew there was truth underneath. The temptation to lash out at her tormentor, to make him feel even a fraction of what he'd put her through, had been almost overwhelming. Choosing to listen instead, to allow for the possibility of redemption, was harder than any fight. "That's why you're better than him." Julian reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture that had become increasingly common over the past few weeks as friendship had evolved into something more. "You understand that hurting him wouldn't have made you feel better. It would have just continued the cycle. My mom would have liked you." Senna squeezed his hand. "She always said the world needed more people who chose kindness over revenge." "Your mom would have been proud of you." Julian's voice was serious. "You kept your promise to her. Not by being passive, but by being better than your circumstances. That's harder." Over the following weeks, Senna noticed other changes rippling through Lincoln High. Students who'd been silent witnesses to bullying were speaking up more, intervening when they saw harassment, reporting incidents to teachers who were now actually responding. The culture was shifting, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. Word had spread about what Senna had endured and how she'd responded, and it had become a reference point. If she could stand up to Bryce Callahan with restraint and courage, maybe others could stand up to their own bullies. A freshman approached Senna one day after class, a small kid with braces and thick glasses who looked terrified but determined. "Some guys have been messing with me, pushing me around, taking my stuff. I saw what you did, and I wanted to ask, how do I make them stop without, fighting?" Senna had no easy answer for him. She couldn't teach him kickboxing in a hallway conversation, couldn't download 3 years of training into his head, but she could share what she'd learned. Stand up straight. Look them in the eye. Don't react the way they want you to. Bullies feed on fear and submission. If you refuse to give them that, they lose power. And find your people, friends who'll back you up, who'll stand with you. You don't have to face it alone. But what if they hit me? The kid's voice was small. Then you defend yourself, document everything, and report it to adults who'll actually help. Senna paused. And if you need backup, come find me or my friends. We'll stand with you. The kid's face lit up with relief and gratitude, and he hurried away looking slightly taller. Julian had witnessed the exchange, and he smiled. You're starting a movement here. Vigilante justice through radical kindness and strategic self-defense. That's a terrible superhero origin story. But Senna was smiling too. Maybe this was how real change happened, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through small acts of courage that inspired others to be brave too. Senna's relationship with Julian deepened naturally over the next month. They'd go to concerts in downtown Sacramento, small venues where his band played to crowds of maybe 50 people who appreciated loud guitars and earnest lyrics. They'd study together in coffee shops, helping each other with homework, talking about college plans and dreams beyond Lincoln High. They'd drive to the river at sunset and sit on the hood of Senna's car, watching the light fade from orange to purple to black, talking about everything and nothing. Julian never pushed for details about her training she wasn't ready to share, never asked her to demonstrate techniques or relive the fight. He understood that her martial arts background was complicated, tied up in grief and identity, and promises she was still learning how to keep. When she did talk about it, about Uncle Marcus's gym, about the feeling of perfect execution, about the fear of becoming her father, he listened without judgment, and offered the kind of understanding that only came from genuinely caring about someone. Their first kiss happened on one of those evenings by the river, when the conversation had lulled into comfortable silence, and Senna realized she was happy. Actually, genuinely happy, for the first time since her mother had died. Julian leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and when their lips met, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. When they broke apart, he was grinning. I've wanted to do that for a while. I know. Senna felt herself smiling back. I'm glad you did. So where do we go from here? Julian's tone was light, but the question was serious. Forward. Senna leaned her head on his shoulder, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. We go forward. The school year progressed with a normalcy that still felt strange after the intensity of those first months. Senna joined the cross-country team, needing the physical outlet and appreciating the meditative quality of long runs. She started a self-defense workshop for interested students, teaching basic techniques and emphasizing awareness and de-escalation over violence. She made actual friends, people who knew her story and chose to be around her anyway, who valued her for more than what she'd done in the cafeteria. Bryce kept his distance, but kept his word too. He didn't bully anyone, didn't try to reclaim his former social status, just went to class and therapy and tried to figure out who he was without the armor of arrogance and aggression. Connor and Marcus had transferred to different schools, unable to handle the social consequences of their actions. Tyler graduated early and left for college a semester ahead, eager to escape Lincoln and start over somewhere nobody knew his history. On the last day of the semester, Senna found herself back in the cafeteria during lunch, sitting with Julian and their friends when she saw a scene playing out near the entrance. A larger student was pushing a smaller one, classic intimidation stance, drawing a crowd. Without thinking, Senna stood up and walked over. Hey! Her voice carried authority she hadn't possessed 6 months ago. That's enough. The larger student turned, recognized her, and his aggressive stance faltered. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now." Senna positioned herself between the two students, not threatening but unmistakably protective. "Walk away." For a moment, it could have gone either way. The larger student was weighing his options, calculating whether it was worth escalating. But then he looked at the crowd forming, at the phones coming out to record, at the way other students were moving to stand behind Senna in a show of solidarity, and he made the smart choice. Whatever, not worth it. He walked away, and the tension dissolved. The smaller student, a sophomore Senna recognized from her self-defense workshop, looked up at her with relief. "Thanks. I could have handled it, but it's nice to know someone has your back." Senna smiled. "That's what we do here now. We look out for each other." As Senna walked back to her table, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. But it was different now. Not the predatory attention she'd experienced in those first weeks, but something closer to respect. She'd become a symbol of something, resistance maybe, or courage, or the possibility of change. It was a responsibility she hadn't asked for, but had learned to carry. That evening, Senna drove to the gym where she'd secretly been training again. A small place in South Sacramento where the owner knew Uncle Marcus and had agreed to let her work out in exchange for helping teach kids' classes. She wrapped her hands carefully, feeling the familiar rhythm of the movements, pulled on her gloves, and approached the heavy bag. For 3 rounds, she worked through combinations: jab, cross, hook, roundhouse kick, elbow, knee. Each technique thrown with full power but perfect control, the bag swinging on its chain, the impact reverberating through her body. When she finished, sweat-soaked and breathing hard, she looked at herself in the mirror. The girl looking back was different from the one who'd arrived at Lincoln High months ago. Stronger, not just physically, but in ways that were harder to quantify. She'd faced her fears, broken her silence, defended herself and others, and managed to do it without becoming the monster her mother had been afraid she'd become. The promise had been kept, just not in the way either of them had anticipated. Her phone buzzed with a text from Julian. "Dinner tomorrow? Want you to meet my parents officially." Senna smiled, typed back, "Yes," and started unwrapping her hands. The gym was empty, except for her and the owner's cat, a massive orange tabby who'd claimed the front desk as his territory. The space smelled like sweat and leather and determination, a scent that Senna had missed desperately and now appreciated even more deeply because she'd chosen to come back to it. As she drove home through Sacramento streets, Senna thought about everything that had happened: the harassment, the fear, the decision to fight back, the consequences and the change, the friendships and the relationship, and the sense of purpose she'd discovered. She thought about Bryce and his halting apology, about the smaller victories that came after the big confrontation, about the way one person's courage could ripple outward and change an entire culture. Most of all, she thought about her mother. Senna had kept her promise, not by being passive, not by accepting abuse, but by being strong enough to defend herself without losing her humanity in the process. She'd learned that true strength wasn't about dominating others or proving superiority. It was about knowing your power and choosing carefully how to use it. It was about standing up without putting others down. It was about breaking cycles instead of perpetuating them. The final month of school passed quickly. Senna maintained her grades, continued her self-defense workshops, ran cross-country, and planned for college applications. She and Julian became one of those couples who made being together look easy, supporting each other's goals and giving each other space to grow. Bryce finished his therapy and his suspension and graduated quietly, leaving Lincoln with none of the fanfare that had surrounded his earlier years. The school's new anti-bullying policies were showing results, with more students reporting incidents and more teachers actually intervening. On graduation day, Senna walked across the stage in her cap and gown to collect her diploma, and the applause was genuine and warm. She wasn't valedictorian or homecoming queen or captain of any team. She was just Senna Ashford, a student who'd survived a terrible situation and come out stronger, and that was enough. Julian graduated with her, along with Grace and Devon and Priya, all of them bound for different colleges, but committed to staying in touch. At the graduation party Julian's family threw, his father pulled Senna aside for a private conversation. "I wanted to thank you," David Torres said, his expression serious, "for being a good influence on Julian, but also for being an example of the kind of courage and restraint that I've spent my career trying to defend. I just did what I had to do." Senna felt uncomfortable with the praise. "No," David's voice was firm. "You did what you chose to do. There's a difference. You could have done much worse to Bryce that day. You could have seriously injured him and claimed self-defense. And given the circumstances, you probably would have been cleared. But you didn't. You chose mercy. That's not instinct. That's character." The words settled into Senna's chest, warm and affirming, and she realized he was right. Every moment of that fight had been a choice. Not to maim. Not to humiliate beyond what was necessary. Not to become the kind of person who used power to dominate others. Those choices had been harder than the physical confrontation, and they'd mattered more in the long run. Summer arrived with its promise of lazy days and new beginnings. Senna worked at Uncle Marcus's gym, which had opened a Sacramento branch and needed experienced instructors. She taught classes for kids and adults, emphasizing discipline and control and the importance of using martial arts for self-defense only. She continued dating Julian, their relationship deepening as they planned for a future that might include different colleges, but would definitely include each other in whatever form that took. One evening in late July, Senna received a message on social media from someone she didn't know. The message was short. "I saw your video from Lincoln High. I'm being bullied at my school, and I don't know what to do. Did you ever regret fighting back?" Senna stared at the message for a long time, thinking about how to answer. Did she regret it? The fight had consequences. The suspension, the investigation, the stress on Aunt Rosa, the way some people still looked at her like she was dangerous. But it had also freed her, had allowed her to reclaim her dignity, had changed Lincoln High's culture in ways that were still reverberating. Most importantly, it had taught her that strength and mercy weren't opposites. They were partners. She typed her response carefully. "I don't regret defending myself, but I'm glad I did it without losing who I am." The real victory wasn't putting him on the ground. It was getting up afterwards and choosing not to become like him. Whatever you decide to do, make sure you can live with who you become in the process. She hit send and set down her phone, hoping whoever received the message would understand what she was trying to say. Violence wasn't the answer, but neither was accepting abuse. The path between those extremes was narrow and difficult to walk, but it was the only path worth taking. 6 months after the cafeteria fight, on the first day of her first semester of college, Senna walked through the campus of UC Davis with her backpack and her carefully hidden past, and her hard-won wisdom. She'd chosen criminal justice as her major, wanting to work within the system to help others who felt powerless. To be the kind of advocate she'd needed during those terrible weeks at Lincoln, she'd kept training, kept teaching, kept honoring her mother's memory by being strong without being cruel. As she found her first class, Senna caught her reflection in a window, tall and straight, head high, eyes forward. She looked confident, capable, free. The girl who'd arrived at Lincoln High trying to disappear had learned to take up space without apologizing for it. The promise she'd made to her mother had evolved into something more nuanced. Not to never fight, but to fight only when necessary and always with restraint. Not to be passive, but to be powerful without being destructive. Senna smiled at her reflection, thinking about Bryce's apology and the freshman she'd defended and the message from a stranger asking for advice. She thought about Julian waiting for her after class, about the self-defense workshop she'd be teaching on Saturdays, about the future stretching ahead with possibilities she was brave enough to claim. She'd learned the hardest lesson, that true strength comes not from the power to destroy, but from the wisdom to choose mercy. That standing up for yourself doesn't require putting others down. That one person's courage can inspire change in ways that ripple outward far beyond the initial impact. That breaking cycles of violence is harder and more important than perpetuating them. That you can be a fighter without being a bully, powerful without being cruel, strong without being destructive. Her mother would have been proud. Senna was finally proud of herself. She walked into her classroom, claimed a seat in the middle where she could see everything, and got ready to begin again. The past was behind her, marked by scars and lessons and victories both large and small. The future was ahead, full of challenges and opportunities and the chance to become whoever she chose to be. And in that moment, on the first day of a new chapter, Senna Ashford was exactly where she needed to be. Not hiding, not running, not apologizing for taking up space in the world. Just existing with dignity and strength and the hard-won knowledge that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show mercy to those who showed you none. That sometimes the strongest choice is the one that refuses violence even when violence would be justified. That sometimes the only way to win is to be better than your circumstances, better than your opposition, better than the easiest path forward. She'd kept her promise to her mother, honored her father's memory by choosing a different path, and found herself in the process. That was enough. That was everything.